listening to the Zetitic Newscast on the Zetitic News Network with your hosts, Dave, and Xavier Diamant. Proceed by inquiry.
My message is that we'll be watching you. This is all wrong. I shouldn't be up here. I should be back in school on the other side of the ocean. Yet you all come to us young people for hope. How dare you? You have stolen my dreams and my childhood with your empty words, and yet I'm one of the lucky ones. People are suffering. People are dying. Entire ecosystems are collapsing. We are in the beginning of a mass extinction, and all you can talk about is money and fairy tales of eternal economic growth. How dare you? For more than 30 years, the science has been crystal clear. How dare you continue to look away and come here saying that you're doing enough when the politics and solutions needed are still nowhere in sight? You say you hear us and that you understand the urgency. But no matter how sad and angry I am, I do not want to believe that. Because if you really understood the situation and still kept on failing to act, then you would be evil, and that I refuse to believe. The popular idea of cutting our emissions in half in 10 years only gives us a 50% chance of staying below 1.5 degrees and the risk of setting off irreversible chain reactions beyond human control. 50% may be acceptable to you, but those numbers do not include tipping points, most feedback loops, additional warming hidden by toxic air pollution, or the aspects of equity and climate justice. They also rely on my generation sucking hundreds of billions of tons of your CO2 out of the air with technologies that barely exist. So a 50% risk is simply not acceptable to us, we who have to live with the consequences. To have a 67% chance of staying below a 1.5 degrees of global temperature rise, the best odds given by the IPCC, the world had 420 gigatons of CO2 left to emit back on January 1st, 2018. Today, that figure is already down to less than 350 gigatons. How dare you pretend that this can be solved with just business as usual and some technical solutions? With today's emissions levels, that remaining CO2 budget will be entirely gone within less than 8.5 years. There will not be any solutions or plans presented in line with these figures here today, because these numbers are too uncomfortable and you are still not mature enough to tell it like it is. You are failing us. But the young people are starting to understand your betrayal. The eyes of all future generations are upon you. And if you choose to fail us, I say we will never forgive you.
This is Dave, and Xavier Diamant with the Zetitic Newscast, and I think we can safely stop it right there.
Yeah.
And we wanted to start with Greta Thunberg in the United Nations because, man, between the last episode and this episode, so much dramatic news has come out, and it just seems like, I mean, I think we were both on the same page that this is going to have to be the topic du jour for episode 2, because it was such a huge distraction from so many more important developments. But the United Nations got together, they farted, and this this individual in her little speech that you heard was like all that anybody was talking about, and I think that maybe inspired you to start working on this next article, which has yet to be published. It's maybe a work in progress, but I thought it was a very apropos title for this episode. You always have a way with the headlines and the words. Climate catastrophizing, elite misanthropy, scarcity, psychosis, and adolescent authoritarianism. It really hits on all the major notes, I think, of what's going on here. So I've got a lot of content. You've got a lot written here that we can talk about. Xavier, where do you want to start with this story and the media circus around it?
Well, I mean, I think it's important to note that usually when there's a media bombardment and kind of a massive echo chamber effect that's created, a media storm, it's there to pretty much cover for something else. And I think it's interesting to note that we went from talking about Epstein and the massive implications that has for the entire geopolitical matrix, and all of a sudden it's like, oh well, here's this child that we can all sort of voyeuristically perceive, giving us all this scripted advice from this big money effort to more or less convince people that they're parasites and there just needs to be less of us and we need to go with less. And
in her speech, she keeps referring to you.
Oh, sure.
Who is she talking to? Who is she talking about as far as you is concerned? And she's citing all these statistics. Is she talking to the United Nations ambassadors? Is she talking to the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change? Who is she talking? What is she referring to?
I mean, from just the thrust of what she's presenting, it seems to be directed at your kind of average middle class, quote unquote, first worlder. And it's
is that because they're the ones responsible for all
of the horrible stuff,
the consumption that is driving the emittance of CO2? Is that?
Yeah, and the notice that she said the politics and the solutions are nowhere in sight. So this is very much a politicized arena of discussion, and like we already have enough sort of browbeating within the whole conversation of climate change.
How dare you?
Well, right. It's like, how dare you stop with just browbeating? Like, we need serious totalitarian boots on the ground and penalties being exacted against everyone. I mean, that seems to be the kind of thing. Like, you're not, and there's this like quasi oracle vibe that they're trying to manufacture around her, where she gets to talk about huge years in the future and like multiple generations going forward
with complete certainty and confidence that this is what is going to happen. I don't know.
You are not yet mature enough.
I don't know if 50% is okay. It's
right.
It's okay with you, but it's not okay with me.
And everyone who may be born in the future who will feel exactly the same as I do. I mean, it's like the new Oracle of Delphi, but it's in this materialistic pseudoscientific garb. And it's interesting that there's a lot of commentary about how this is sort of a classic form of like, media media storm, but also child abuse on the part of, taking kind of advantage of her various antisocial proclivities and her acting skills. I mean, her parents are famous celebrities in Sweden.
Right.
And most American audiences are never going to really know that right off the bat if they just
And
hear
even if
this
you
quote.
told them, they'd be like, "What's wrong with that?"
Yeah, they'd be like, "Oh, well, celebrities are special people. That's why we celebrate them." But the reality is, it's a form of basically socially acceptable, quote unquote, child abuse that everyone wants more of, in a way. Like, people can't get enough of this greensplaining, so we might as well have a child lecture the entire developing world about it.
Greensplaining.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there's something about a child telling millions of adults that they're not mature enough. I mean,
Right.
what is she talking about?
Right. It's almost like she's channeling this narrator.
The state.
Yeah, the state.
The state.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was the most confusing thing to me about her speech, is that she was referring to you. She's at the United Nations. And I'm if she's not talking about the United Nations, I suppose you're right. She'd have to be talking about the consumers.
And they're, quote unquote, democratically elected representatives who are trying to consider all aspects of
Right.
economic considerations and social considerations. But she's basically saying, oh, all that is inadequate. We need to scrap any kind of consideration about economic well-being or industrial efficiency or any kind of market solutions. All that needs to go the way of, the dodo bird, and we have to usher in all of this boots on the ground enforcement,
Right.
totalitarianism through an internationalist regime.
Right. So, like, how does this manifests in a number of different ways, but let's just take a nearby example. The capital city of North Carolina, Raleigh, has some sort of association with the ICC, right? They've established a sort of sustainability office, right? And then they go about implementing the agenda, which is passed down, right, from on high,
Yep.
from the United Nations and so on. So I guess Greta is upset that there is still some semblance of local control in the form of these these sustainability offices, which invariably do end up, clamping down on people's rights. You have the installation of electric chargers and stuff, as if that is
Smart
some sort of,
meters. Yep.
yeah, that must be her gripe, right? Is that these technical solutions, which aren't even technical solutions,
Not
they're
really.
total boondoggle,
Yeah. Scams.
greensplaining, scams, to use your word. I'm guessing that's just not enough
Yeah.
tyranny for her.
No. Well, it just goes back to the whole watermelon philosophy. You can drape really hardcore, violent, communistic principles and practices with this greenwashing effect. Green on the outside, red on the inside.
Right.
And the green element is there to, because green is related to blue, and
Right.
green is, it's interesting that it's yellow and blue, just as a color. And ultimately, it's there to appeal to liberally minded, progressively minded individuals who have been saturated in this very same rhetoric for decades. So it's meant to sort of activate the feedback loop and, trigger a bunch of parroting within the population. It needs to be on people's lips. It needs to be on people's minds. People need to be thinking, oh, well, I don't want to be considered a denialist, and maybe it is a little bit too alarmist what I'm hearing through the mainstream, but something's got to be done.
Right. Something's got to be done, even if it means allowing the internet, major internet companies to, not only read what you're saying and report it accordingly, but to essentially implement, social credit score type, internet censorship based around these so-called settled issues.
Right.
I think they'll put the whole climate issue right next to the Holocaust.
Sure.
Any questions about that, the reality around nuclear bombs, let's just say ancient history, and
Atomic
so on,
theory in general.
heliocentrism, all of that
Right.
is going to be put under the same sort of algorithmic, suppression techniques. But
Right.
I want to sort of move to a different set of
Element of this.
elements of this, right? She's at the United Nations.
Mm-hmm.
She's upset about the environmental crisis, that she claims is going to result in an extinction level event. Okay.
Yeah, I wonder how that could possibly come about without the state killing its people. I mean, isn't that basically the largest human death toll element in history? Is organized governments slaughtering their own populations. What is it, the 20th century alone? Democide.
Right. So, I mean, in theory, she's in a good place to make some criticisms, right? But I don't think she's like pointing them in the right direction. I think there are legit issues, environmental issues.
That absolutely
right?
is certainly the case. I mean, ecological destruction is certainly real. It's done by the people who are proposing all of these solutions.
How about that? It's like she's asking the robber barons, to
Definitely
to liberate.
Absolutely.
Exactly. So I've got the Wikipedia up here on Environmental Modification Convention, which was formerly the Convention on the Prohibition of Military or Any Other Hostile Use of Environmental Modification Techniques, which is a pretty vague term. Environmental modification techniques. I mean, I cut the grass every couple of weeks. That's an environmental modification, right?
Exactly.
But what are they really talking about? I mean, we did cover this in one of the prior episodes, and this is going to be a recurring theme, and that is
Definitely.
Cloud seeding,
ionospheric manipulation, upper
electromagnetic
elevation, magnetic
manipulation as well, stratospheric aerosol injections. And they, the UN and many countries have sort of, signed this treaty. They've established this sort of a soft agreement. I mean, nobody follows it because we know what they're doing.
Right.
But if Greta had a real gripe, wouldn't it be towards a literal global program such as is stratospheric aerosol injections? Right?
Right.
She could have used this
yeah.
platform to actually
Absolutely.
make a complaint about something that is like a wide scale conspiracy compared to the disparate and local effects of people, driving to and from their work and
Right.
having, cows on their farm and so on, which
Building condos on the beach. Yeah, that sort of thing. And it's like, well, if you look at this treaty or this convention, it says that many states do not require this as a complete ban on the use of herbicides in warfare, such as Agent Orange, but it does require case-by-case consideration. So the people who are trying to prevent states from using weather modification and geoengineering instrumentation also are like, oh, well, you can use, biological weapons, but on a case-by-case consideration.
Right. Right. And, we are sort of speaking on a level where we've already sort of come to an understanding about the reality of the global geoengineering program. But I did load a clip that, a couple clips, that we can sort of reference that, for the, the uninitiated, let's say, should maybe raise the awareness level a little bit, around this subject of weather modification, and one should definitely question, what they have in this whole discussion about climate change. When we're talking about climate change this, climate change that, which really I shouldn't even use that term because it's
kind of misleading. It
totally
gives it sort of this neutral, like act of God type.
Well, they can't be wrong when it used to be global warming, which was that is still actually the core issue that the
whole
climate
change talking point has morphed from,
is that the ice caps are going to melt. Did we forget about that?
Oh, yeah.
Now it's become sort of this more nebulous thing of like,
Temperatures could increase.
Extreme weather outcomes.
Extreme weather outcomes.
The hurricanes are worse and
exactly.
worse, and it's like, well, when you know that they can modify such things,
They can
how do we not know
amplify.
that the problem isn't actually the state? They are blaming us for things that they actually have the power to create. Okay, and if you just think we're totally out to lunch, talking like this, I'm just going to go ahead and play the clip. So.
Oh yeah.
And now we're learning that scientists and researchers are looking at how to change the weather on purpose. That's right. Lasers now could one day manipulate rain and lightning. CBS This Morning contributor Michio Kaku is a physics professor at City College of New York. Professor, nice to see you. Extraordinary seeing Al Gore and Bill Clinton there together with Charlie, wasn't it?
That's right, yeah.
Yeah, they did not get into this discussion,
No.
though. But it is fascinating. I mean, lasers, really, to change the weather?
That's right. Well, as Mark Twain once famously said, everyone complains about the weather, but no one ever does anything about it. Well, instead of doing a rain dance, we physicists are firing trillion-watt lasers into the sky to actually precipitate rain clouds and actually bring down lightning bolts. This is potentially a game changer.
But this is experimental.
It's experimental. However, in the laboratory so far, it works. When you have water vapor and you have dust particles or ice crystals, you can precipitate rain. It condenses around the seeds. These seeds can also be created by laser beams. By firing trillion-watt lasers, you rip apart the electrons, creating what are called ions, and these ions act like seeds, like dust particles, bringing down rain and even lightning.
Go ahead.
Well, this fascinates me in part because, too, I remember reading the stories that China had used this during the Olympics, that the USSR had used this after Chernobyl to create rain clouds. I mean, did those really work then? We have some of these capabilities now?
Inconclusive. Even in the 60s, the CIA used this to bring down monsoons during the Vietnam War.
Okay. Whoa, sorry for the feedback, folks. Still working on the audio engineering here, but what a clip, right?
Yeah.
Inconclusive, Xavier. She said, I remember reading they did that, in Chernobyl to make it rain. And
Wait, Chernobyl was in the
80s.
Okay, that was almost 40 years ago. Yeah, and then we used it in Vietnam.
And look how cavalierly Michio Kaku says, trillion-watt laser beams, just separate.
What's the Arthur Conan Doyle quote? Any sufficiently advanced technology is indistinguishable from magic. So he has this big theoretical blanket that he puts over it to make him seem like this amazing authority. But ultimately, they're just really tinkering with the substrate of reality with these crazy fortified weapons, essentially. And lasers aren't what you think. I mean, the graphic that they put up there is kind of misleading, where it's this beam,
Little black box.
right? It's just like this, the most powerful lasers, the trillion-watt lasers, that they're invisible. Like, you can't see
Right.
the laser. And that's what makes it so
So if this was like
dangerous.
if this was like a balloon-mounted laser with, advanced targeting, and they wanted to zap a political dissident somewhere, I mean, it's only a matter of infrastructure, right?
Right, and political justifications, I guess, because, I mean, geoengineering techniques and instrumentation is used daily at this point. But there's all these treaties about, you can't use it for X, and you can't use it for Y, and you can't use it for Z. So, I mean, they do have the same sort of conventions around lasers in warfare. And, we can't do it here, and we can't do it there, but yeah, we have it. And we could very easily implement it and just call it something else to the public.
It's just a matter of prioritization and the the political risk of any sort of operation. Getting the stooges to operate the technology and to leverage it for evil,
Right.
essentially. Talking about these trillion-watt lasers. What
Right.
does a trillion-watt laser, what does a trillion-watt radio tower look like?
Wow.
I mean, you've got HARP. That's what is, publicly acknowledged.
Right.
Okay, you think about how much land is available that none of us, I mean, Do you
Right.
think Google Earth gives you an actual, surface level depiction of what's out there across
way.
the world? You think
No
they're
way.
going to allow classified areas? Okay, classified areas are still known by government employees, okay, that have access. And then with Epstein, going back to, this is really distracting from.
Right.
You got a guy who, just one guy owns an island and is building underground basements, etc.
Yep.
You look at some of the mansions and stuff, the capabilities of these billionaires, this aristocratic breakaway civilization. I mean, who the hell knows what kind of underground cities and other things. And so while they're, catastrophizing a surface level, extinction level event, I mean, they're both potentially perpetrating that with their childish experimentation with advanced technologies.
Right.
While they're the ones taking our wealth to actually build such, housings that could withstand their own weaponry that they're playing with, versus some potential, like the ice caps melting and maybe flooding some coastal cities. Like, we don't all live on the coast anyways.
Well, yeah, but I mean, you still have all these developments going up. Like, if this is really such a pressing thing and the richest people are funding these developments, why don't they pull the funding from all these new projects on the coast? Is it really that short-sighted, or do the money manipulators really know what this whole green scare is all about, which is
Right.
basically whipping up more money so they can, inflate
Go to the
real
next
estate.
level.
Exactly.
Whatever that is.
Go to the next threshold of what they can try to get away with.
Yeah. Well, I have another good clip, and we're sort of driving towards, what the final solution is, right? Clearly Greta's not criticizing the right people, or should
Right.
be talking about the politicians who are actually, like we've been talking about, experimenting with these crazy weapons, manipulating, playing God.
Yep.
And meanwhile making, serious ecological destruction.
Definitely.
They've admitted that they can steer hurricanes.
Yeah.
And the thing is, it is experimental. So
but it works in the lab.
Well, what is the lab to them?
The lab is
that's where
the
they
world.
get satanically
Right.
semantic, and they
Right.
would be like, "Oh, well, our laboratory is going to be Southern Texas today." That's how they
Right.
see it, because they are above their property, according to FDA Section 201G1, which specifies a drug is any article intended to change the structure of man or other animal. And what that says is everything. It says that you are an animal to them,
Right.
because it's other animal.
And that's why, the aerosols that they spray, barium and all these oxides, that is them basically saying en masse, oh, this is medicine for y'all. It's basically pesticides.
Right.
Y'all are pests to us.
Right.
So that in itself shows you the real core of the thinking.
Before we started recording, you were talking about a meme you saw
Oh,
on
yeah.
Instagram that was about Epstein that we couldn't find. But there was another meme
classic.
that I could pull up. It was, I'm sure Owen Benjamin took it from someone else, but it was the periodic table elements, barium and aluminum, put next to each other as ball.
Uh-huh.
And
those
the
are
implication-
those are the major oxides. Yeah.
And he was correctly, I think, pointing out, that this is essentially black magic, in a sense.
Sure.
Their alchemy. With what they want to transform us, they want to degrade us, they want to kill us.
That's right.
It's a hard task they have, to get us to kill ourselves, because I think maybe they have to follow the principle that they have to get us to turn our free will against ourselves, and by getting us to sort of accept you know, what Greta's saying, and to
As
go along
the new wisdom for
yeah.
everyone to worship. Yeah, we all can live with being treated as pests because that's just what we breathe, and that's what we have to do to make sure that our terraqueous orb survives.
Right.
And well, it just goes to show. I mean, in so many different levels, there is a kind of incorporated charlatanry where mumbo jumbo is weaponized as expertise that's settled and irrefutable and based on high percentage consensus. Because what is the thing? The IPCC, 97% consensus of the best scientists in the world.
Well, I have another clip on that
just-
note. The IPCC is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, right? And this
Right.
is like who everyone delegates their brain cells to in government. And this is local, folks. Mm-hmm. If you live,
It trickles all the way down.
it
to your
trickles
local
all the way down.
municipality.
Just look it up on your county's website. They're all participating in some form of sustainability program or some
right.
shit like that.
And the more "quote unquote" progressive the area is, the more thoroughly entrenched
Right.
the system is.
But when you start talking to people in your local government and you start to peel back the onion of bureaucracy that this is, and the psychology of those people who are, in a sense, you know, implementing it, you know, locally for you,
For your own
in
good.
your service,
For your own good.
they will invariably at some point start talking about the IPCC and the scientists who staff it, etc. And so, if you're not familiar with the obvious, you know, fallacy of that, we've got another good clip for you.
The idea that humans are heating the planet dangerously is due mostly to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, United Nations body supposedly made up of top climate experts. This IPCC is what the government listens to most.
There's a group of scientists called the International Panel on Climate Change, 4,000 of them. Guys in white coats who run around and don't have a sense of humour. They just measure things. And what they say to us is that it's happening and it's caused by human activity.
But Donna Laframboise, a Canadian journalist, has checked just who writes these IPCC reports and published the results in a new book, The Delinquent Teenager Who Was Mistaken for the World's Top Climate Expert. Donna, thanks for joining me. Is the IPCC really made up of 4,000 top scientists?
Well, that's a fairy tale that politicians really like to believe in, but in fact, that's a very, very problematic number. The last big IPCC report was written by 450 lead authors with an additional 800 secondary authors. That comes to 1,250. That's a pretty big far cry from 4,000. So first of all, the number is problematic. And secondly, is it 4,000 of the world's top scientists? Well, I'm afraid it's not. I found out that some of the people writing this report are actually graduate students in their 20s. They're, some of them 10 years away from even getting their PhDs.
How could that
That's
happen?
not a top scientist. That's, you know what? I'm not sure. I think they just, they didn't get any scrutiny. They really didn't. They said, this is what we're doing, and we're a collection of top scientists, and we all believed them, and no one bothered to double check.
Is it the case then that people were being chosen, some of the examples you give, people who hadn't even done their PhD yet, they're chosen because they agree with the opinion, not because they could prove it?
Well, you know, one suspects that that's what was going on, that in fact people were chosen because they perhaps could be easily led. They were young and could be easily led, perhaps because they had already expressed the kind of opinion the IPCC brass was hoping the report would express. It's not clear, but it certainly looks fishy.
And lastly, we were told that it relies on peer-reviewed science. That doesn't seem to be the case from what you seem to have established.
Well, that's the other thing. That's the other big fairy tale here. The chairman of the IPCC has been going around the planet assuring us that the reports are based only, solely, and exclusively on peer-reviewed science. Well, when I actually decided to check out how many of the sources cited by the IPCC were published in peer-reviewed scientific academic journals, only 2/3 were. And we also discovered that 21 out of the 44 chapters had so few peer-reviewed sources that chapter would have received an F on a grade school report card.
It seems to me, Donna, what you also found out was a lot we were reviewing on green groups literature, and I think people really should look at what you've come up with, because I think it'll really startle them how thin this material is. Donna Laframboise, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, yeah. So this is, someone who's got some journalistic, investigative scrutiny skills. And she was able to basically unpack the outrageous claim that, the science is crystal clear. Everything is certain. It's settled. 100%. Now pay an extra 20% on your labor because of your carbon footprint. Well, I'm glad that she was able to debunk a lot of that and excavate the lack of substance, ultimately, to the claims in these IPCC reports. And I just think that you see this narrative morph over time, with all these buzzwords and this kind of suffocating formalism around how no one can really question the methods or the outcomes of said evidence or consensuses because they don't have the quote-unquote approved credentials. Well, it doesn't take, clearly it doesn't even take a PhD to write what's supposedly subtle science. So
Right.
It's just
So what's all the hubbub about having a degree if
Right.
the top scientists in the world can not have one?
Right. So
10 years from a PhD? Are you serious?
Whoa. That's pretty excessive. I mean, in the grand scheme of things, ultimately people are wanting to gesticulate about political convictions and passions, but they need this veneer of authority to lend their opinions legitimacy. So that's why they glom on to all these different NGOs and these movements that want them to peddle a certain line. They want a certain opinion reinforced as though it's fact.
Right.
And that's why they have to source all these, young zealots, basically.
Right.
Just to add to this gestalt that, this is a growing serious matter because, people are able to regurgitate all of the talking points in a like fashion, and that's what makes it settled, essentially.
Well, Xavier, you have a way with words, and you can talk a lot, and you can provide your opinion, but I don't hear you talking a lot about evidence. And so I think we might want to spend some time.
Oh yeah, let's look at what constitutes evidence. That's awesome.
So this is climate.nasa.gov, which if you guys listening out there, if you have any family members who work for NASA, have you asked them what they do? Have you asked them what kind of spaceships or new spacefaring technology they've been working on directly? If you haven't, I would recommend you try to do that, because I would bet 90% of the time you're going to get an answer about climate.
Yeah.
And you're going to get an answer about monitoring weather. And you're going to get answers like that, because NASA is really not a space exploration company like they promote themselves to be. No. They are more of a front PR sort of legacy vestige of the Nazi paperclip operation. Disney science fiction industrial complex.
Right.
Right. And now any sort of technical collaborating they do with private aerospace companies and or other technology companies is really about monitoring, the surface and the climate and the weather. So anyways, they've got this page. They set it up. They set the table real nice. Facts. Okay. So don't even question anything below this, right? Like below this, it's all, you can't even question it. Okay. So climate change. How do we know? All right. I'm going to turn it over to you, man. Just talk about this chart a little bit.
Okay. So
what are they trying to say here?
First of all, this graph is based on the comparison of atmospheric samples contained on ice cores and more recent direct measurements. And it supposedly provides evidence that atmospheric CO2 has increased since the Industrial Revolution. Okay, but what if this, parabolic ascent that they're claiming from the carbon dioxide level parts per million in 1950, which it says was 315 parts per million, it's now supposedly at 415 parts per million. So this sort of chartist depiction more or less is saying that, according to this trajectory, we're going to get to a billion parts, 1,000 parts per million,
Right.
really soon. And that's just, who cares if it's plant food? Who cares that it's what trees breathe? We're in a greenhouse here.
Look.
And we're going to get baked.
Look, to believe that they accurately measured here
Right.
in the current era, which we can talk about, what and how they measure
Right.
this, they would also have to be able to accurately measure all of this. And this is, am I correct, 800,000 years that they're measuring? So how do they do that? Okay, so it's the comparison of atmospheric samples contained in ice cores, which where are they getting those? Isn't that mostly Antarctica, right?
Oh yeah, and this goes to the sort of seance magic around
Carbon dating.
Carbon dating. Yeah, it's quite the shamanic process of interpretation if you really look into the methodology that establishes it as hard and fast evidence. But honestly, yeah, the whole thing of this ice, it must be like the rings on a tree where we can determine its age.
But look, they've set up this military restriction of, quote, Antarctica, and that's where they have their apocalyptic seed bank. That's where they don't have public commercial flights flying over. That's where they don't allow citizens to traverse and explore
under serious penalty of law
or death.
Like they can shoot you.
And that's also where they seem to have a penchant for drilling a lot of ice. And this is where they get their magical evidence of past 800,000 plus years of carbon atmospheric samples. So in other words, you have to believe that they can measure this accurately here and also procure it here. Now, we could also talk about how deep we've publicly drilled.
Oh yeah,
it's like 8 miles, right?
Yeah, that's the deepest from the surface that we've gone.
How do they know that? Let's just say 8 miles of ice in Antarctica is equivalent to 800,000 years of time. How do they know that? How do they know that?
Yeah, there's no way that they can actually know that. And even if you look at this chart, like they're basically putting this graph together from pure inferential guesswork, and that even if you look at the parabolic ascent, like even when it comes to charting, like usually that kind of parabolic ascent gets rejected almost immediately.
In any sort of analyst community, that would be like,
No.
that's very unlikely to happen. Like,
It's like basically an error. I mean, that errors happen like that in the market all the time, where a price spikes up super fast,
and that's when the plunge protection team comes in and basically shuts the markets down.
right. So
That's another subject.
That's another subject altogether. But it leads into the broader topic of chartism and the whole Cartesian method of analyzing data.
All right, we're obsessing over this chart. So, all right. So the Earth's let's zoom in for the readers here. The Earth's climate has changed throughout history. Oh, thanks, Captain Obvious.
Goodness.
Just in the last
Brilliant.
650,000 years, there have been 7 cycles of glacial advance and retreat, with the abrupt end of the last ice age about 7,000 years ago, making the beginning of the modern climate era and of human civilization. Okay, this right here, I mean, this is like basically a creation myth,
Yeah, this is a grand narrative.
right?
Yeah.
And if you're supposed to believe what they say you should do with respect to your carbon footprint, that means you also have to believe that the end of the last ice age was about 7,000 years ago, marking the begin of the modern climate era and of human civilization. So they're basically saying human civilization started 7,000 years ago. I mean, that's as crazy, right, as the quote, Christians that believe the earth was created 6,000 years ago. If you want to compare that, how is this any less radical of an opinion?
Right.
Right?
I mean, there's no real forensic methodology. It's all inductive inferential hermeneutics. There's no actual heuristic method to verify these years.
But-
They're like rounded out.
But also, Xavier, this contradicts many archaeological
Of course it does. Absolutely it
discoveries.
does.
Right
it's
here
total
on
bollocks.
the facts page, how do we know about climate change? I mean, it's just ridiculous. Okay, let's move on from this ridiculous.
I mean, global. I mean, it just goes to show that this is their new boondoggle, basically.
Yeah.
Where of course they're not going anywhere in space, because space is a privation of the ether, and we can't go anywhere. So.
Right. So there was another interesting contradictory NASA page, since we're on the NASA subject.
Right.
And it just, to me, I wanted to highlight it because it refutes the other climate change, global warming myth that the increase in human population, human industrial activity, etc., is the reason for ecosystem collapse. What else? Just the whole apocalypticism around the climate change. Our existence and our growth as a species is a cancer to the earth, etc. And that's NASA's own. If they do have a service, I'm cool with weather balloons. We can monitor what's going on as for benevolent purposes. I mean, this is a interesting thing to know. That human activity in China and India dominates the greening of Earth. So these are the two the most populous countries. They have, that's despite China's best efforts, right? Billions of people, the dirtiest factories, right? In both of these places. Yeah, there's pollution. Yeah, there's ecosystem problems as a result of concentrations of populations and lack of technology and wealth and a whole host of socio-demographic issues,
inability to properly utilize waste,
right?
Lots of waste pile up.
The earth is doing fine. It's, if anything, that it's hard to tame. Just talk to those people,
right? And
they got some of the wildest wildlife that'll kill you in both of those places. So
that's true. It's very, very hostile environment in between there with the Himalayas. But if you look at most of India is extremely lush.
Yep. So, on a more historical, philosophical
Yes.
note, right? You wrote this, or you're writing this article. You'll have to check back on ztitic.news. Check our Instagram, ztitic_news_network on Instagram, and we'll make a post when that drops, when you drop it. But you included some videos, and you
Oh yeah.
you wanted to highlight this. You want to set up this clip here?
Yes. Okay. So this is W.G. Tarpley back in I believe it was a late '90s lecture that was reposted, and he's talking about the Venetian period, where they were one of the mightiest naval forces in the world and had an oligarchical system of power that basically manipulated the sciences of its time and dovetailed it with a bunch of misanthropic elite policies that they wanted to implement. And their governing philosophy back in the 14th through late 16th century was alarmingly similar to a lot of the rhetoric we hear today about planetary carrying capacity and how we're ultimately a net negative on the surface of the terraqueous orb we fantasize as our homeworld. But I like this investigative treatment of the topic from a philosophical, historical vantage point. I think Tarpley does a good job here.
Now, Francesco Zorzi was the envoy of this group to Henry VIII, to whom he became the resident sex advisor. Zorzi illustrates the typical profile of a Venetian intelligence operative in the early 1500s. He was a Franciscan friar, but his main occupation was black magic of the Rosicrucian variety. He was a conjurer, a necromancer, an apparitionist. If you think of Christopher Marlowe's Dr. Faustus conjuring up the devil, you have the portrait of Zorzi. Now, this is not a good model for the science nerds of any age. As the 1500s turns into the 1600s, this profile began to present serious drawbacks and limitations. Until about 1600, the posture of the Venetian party towards science was one of more or less open hostility, favoring black magic. But in the early 1600s, the group around Sarpi succeeded in changing their public profile from being the enemies of science to being the embodiment of the most advanced and sophisticated science. For several centuries after this, the Venetians would work inside the scientific community to take it over. They would claim to represent the highest expression of scientific values. In this way, they could institutionalize the dead hand of formalism, the fetishism of authority, and irrationalism, so as to stifle the process of discovery. The chief of Venetian intelligence in this period, who made this possible, was Paolo Sarpi. Sarpi and his friend Fulgencio Micanzio were Servite monks. Sarpi was part of an important Venetian salon of the day, the Ridotto Morosini, which met for discussions in the palace of the Morosini family on the Grand Canal. The Morosini were the direct ideological heirs of Contarini. The Morosini salon centered on a discussion of science, and it became a nucleus for the youthful faction of the Venetian oligarchy, the so-called Giovani, who became powerful especially after 1582. The Giovani favored a policy of cooperation with Holland, England, and France in conflicts against the Austrian and Spanish Habsburgs and against the papacy. There was another faction called I Vecchi, the Oldies, which serviced the Venetian network on the Spanish and papal side, and these, of course, were quite extensive. Now, we have told in other locations how Sarpi organized and unleashed the 30 Years' War in Central Europe. using agents like Max von Thurn und Taxis, Christian von Anhalt, Christoph von Dohna, the Elector Palatine Frederick, the so-called Winter King. In this sense, Paolo Sarpi personally exterminated about 1/3 of the entire population of Europe and about 1/2 of the population of Germany and surrounding areas. Sarpi also caused the assassination of King Henry IV of France when Henry opposed Sarpi's designs and exposed him as an atheist. Paolo Sarpi, as we can see, is a worthy predecessor for Bertrand Russell. Now, Sarpi in his own time was most proud of his reputation as a mathematician. One contemporary wrote of him, "I can say about him without any exaggeration whatsoever that no one in Europe excels him in his knowledge of the mathematical sciences." Who thought that? That is the view of Sarpi held by Galileo Galilei. Sarpi.
Wow.
So it's a real Game of Thrones type
Absolutely.
situation, and we're talking about private families.
The mega uber
The
elite.
throne behind the throne,
Yep.
behind the throne,
Yep.
behind the throne.
Mm-hmm.
So this goes way back.
Yeah. Really, a lot of these philosophical developments and kind of ruling ideologies of the Venetian oligarchs percolated through England and into more modern thinkers like Malthus and his influence through the 19th century on various thoughts about basically supplanting this idea of expansion and discovery and growth and replacing it with a scarcity psychosis, which has been proven wrong over and over and over again, but it still lingers because the same oligarchical residues from history
Yeah.
continue to contour all of the world power centers.
Yeah. So it's almost like some sort of weird constant that
Right.
that we as humans, for whatever reason, have to endure, and it's like it's a pattern that people pick up, you know, through time.
Yes.
And it's like a particular pattern on a species of chicken or cow that returns every generation or so, and it just manifests this evil, right?
Theme, variation, recapitulation, definitely. There's, aspects of the sort of mathematicization of facts that you see within Sarpi and then also Newton and Galileo as basically being the forerunners to the Michio Kakus and the Neil deGrasse Tysons and Bill Nyes of today. Now, granted, they're much more sort of derivative spokespeople.
Yeah.
They're not really necessarily part of the same echelon of and entailed in the craftsmanship
No,
of
they
of
don't
the
get to
ideology.
create
Right.
the agenda. They just adopt
They just
it, and they get to
regurgitate
be
and expand on it. Yeah.
the latest and greatest science celebrity
Right.
to pitch the latest form of authoritarianism. It's just
Yeah.
extremely irksome that
This
things
recapitulation
like
keeps
gravity,
coming around. Yep.
things like gravity, heliocentrism,
Atomic theory.
climate change,
Yep.
weather.
Yeah.
It all they're
all
like brothers
conforms
and
to- yep.
sisters with authoritarianism, and I'm
Yep.
just like, what is this all getting to? And it is exterminism
Yep.
at the end of the day. It is
That's right.
murder. It is
Genocide.
genocide, right? So I want to move to another clip on that subject.
Definitely. That whole lecture series is extremely informative.
No, my God, it's so
really-
information dense.
It's
and,
incredible.
And if anything, people realize, the oligarchs of today, I mean, they are blood. they are the ultimate genealogists, right? They
Right.
are obsessed with blood. They're
Yep.
obsessed with genetics and their heritage.
Purity,
they
complexes,
know their
yeah.
family history. They know
Yeah.
what these ancient ancestors did to put them in the positions that
That's
they
right.
are that they are in now. And now it's their time to take the agenda, which is an old ass agenda. Old ass agenda forward to the next step. And so, we can jump over to another, of these modern day oligarchs. We've talked a lot about, sort of the politicians and so on, but what about some of the billionaires?
Sure.
And of course, really, I'm doing this a disservice because anybody who's going to get on TV, right? Anybody who's a publicly known about billionaire, they're not really in the class of people that Tarpley was referring to, but we have to sort of point the finger,
Follow the breadcrumbs a little bit, still.
right?
Yeah.
So this is an interesting one because it's Bill Gates.
Yeah.
And people laugh when I say it, but I always try to throw the logic back at them, the climate change logic, and if the people are edging towards agreeing with some or the other logic that comes out of the United Nations, right? I just go whole hog well, I don't know if the carbon emissions and regulating Freon is the best thing. I think they should focus on the real issues like cow farts, and I'll say it with a dead serious face. And they're like, oh my God, it sounds so ridiculous. And then I'll follow up with a link to one of these, very serious, purportedly scientific people talking about cow farts for real. And to me, I see it and it's ridiculous. And it's funny to see people's reaction when they actually, no, it's not me making a joke.
That's one of the
what
things
they
that
actually
say.
really talk about.
Well, and then, you can also take it to the authoritarian extreme. Oh, that's really not adequate. We really need to be taking away people's houses. We need eminent domain laws. And
they really show their colors then at that
right,
point, right?
Right.
And that's my way of sort of reverse psychology, sort of ferreting it out. But anyways, check this out.
Yeah.
New York City is going to be built every month for the next 40 years. What does that mean? Is that good or bad?
Well, I use that as an opportunity to explain that when people think of climate change, they think mostly about electricity. And that's only a quarter of the emissions come from coal, natural gas plants that are generating your electricity. When we make materials like steel and cement, those two alone are about 1/8 of the emissions. And so the fact that we're going to build these cities, that the world is urbanizing, means that unless you have a totally zero-emission way of making steel and cement, then you haven't come near to solving the overall climate problem. And so moving away, the term clean energy has handicapped the field because that makes people think, oh, maybe it's just electricity and passenger cars, and they don't see agriculture, industry, buses, trains as part of the problem.
One crucial part is agriculture, and one thing you said you were particularly surprised by was how great a problem bovine flatulence is. Do you want to explain what that is and why it's a problem?
Yeah, so the animals that can eat grass have very unusual stomachs that have these bacteria that are methanogenic in there, and so they leak natural gas, both out the front and the back. And so people have said, well, let's change the hay or throw some things in there. And nobody knows how to get rid of
No one knows how to get cows to stop farting.
Exactly, or burping. And so there is artificial meat, but that's at a very early stage. But that's another big source of greenhouse gas emission. So, I'm just trying to make sure that the people who acknowledge the problem, which I think is fantastic, that they understand the breadth of innovation required before you can get anywhere near to what we have to do, which is zero. If it was a 50% reduction, then you could ignore, okay, leave the cows alone. But because we're trying to avoid the temperature continuing to go up, you do need to go to zero. Otherwise, you're continuing to have temperature increase.
You threw a...
Whoa, sorry again. Got to fix that. But
wow.
So he says we got to go to zero. We got to go to zero. 50% isn't enough. That's repeating the Greta Thunberg number, right? Just more chartism, right? Just throwing numbers out there, acting confident and credible. No, he knows nobody's going to look into whatever he's saying. They're just going to kind of feel it out. You know,
it's just neo-Malthusian gobbledygook, basically.
But he is talking about cow farts. They leak methane from the front and the back, and you're supposed to be worried about that. And he tries to really spin it and make it reasonable. And at the end of the day,
makes him sound so insightful and considerate. You know, this is a real issue, guys. It's laughable. I mean, it's totally in line with the whole Sarpi Malthus scarcity psychosis, where, oh, well, you know, it's good for me to have sprawling, environmentally obtrusive campuses and houses, but it's not good for you masses who I kind of despise and don't really interact with day to day. So you need to really get this number down to zero, and maybe the best way to do that is for y'all to maybe eat grass and, you know, just don't reproduce, and maybe in a few generations, you know, we will have prevented another couple billion people from even being born.
Do you notice
we'll be on the right track?
Do you notice how in his speech pattern, he's already sort of living in a world where the control over how things are built, he talks about if there was a way, you know, to build with concrete and steel that was zero emissions, you know, we would do, and it's like he's already anticipating that you are a subscriber to the religion of climate change and that emissions,
and all
this obsession with the CO2 molecule emissions, and you have to buy into so much to be on that level,
right?
Before you ever get on that level, right? You have to buy the whole thing.
It's a package deal. You have to adopt the whole terraqueous orb religion and everything that goes along with that. That, you know, the resources of the earth are more or less fully cataloged, and all of its dimensions are known. And, you know, if, you know, we're just continuing to up our numbers, and, you know, what are we gonna do? And we just can't do this any longer. I mean, it's this kind of contrived panic button that they're trying to push in everyone's face, and, you know, have people adopt this you know, idiotic acquiescence to this adolescent authoritarianism, really. And it's not just Greta Thurnberg either. I mean, it's a long line of spokespeople that have been beating this misanthropic drum for really centuries, if not close to a millennia now.
But they have, you know, as was talked about by Tarpley, you know, not only the genocidal tendency, but this line of thinking, this monopolization of science, the topic of science, goes way, way back. And it, you know, and that the genocidal tendency sort of feeds into the link with authoritarianism, because they always end up in the same place, right? At the same time. And that leads me to the next clip with Bill Gates, right? This is the classic TED talk that, you know, is now buried summarily by the YouTube algorithms. But I was nevertheless able to dig up for this podcast because it's so relevant. I mean, he's talking about climate change, CO2, his little stupid math, you know, his math allegory, whatever.
Pseudo formula.
Let's just go ahead and play it.
Thing on the left, CO2, that you want to get to zero. And that's going to be based on the number of people, the services each person's using on average, the energy on average for each service, and the CO2 being put out per unit of energy. So let's look at each one of these and see how we can get this down to zero. Probably one of these numbers is going to have to get pretty near to zero. That's back from high school algebra, but let's take a look. First, we've got population. The world today has 6.8 billion people. That's headed up to about 9 billion. Now, if we do a really great job on new vaccines, health care, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%. Got a thing on the left, CO2, that you want to get to zero, and that's going to be based on the number of people, the services each person's using on average, the energy on average for each service, and the CO2 being put out per unit of energy. So let's look at each one of these and see how we can get this down to zero. Probably one of these numbers is going to have to get pretty near to zero. That's back from high school algebra, but let's take a look. First, we've got population. The world today has 6.8 billion people. That's headed up to about 9 billion. Now, if we do
So one of these needs to get near to zero.
Okay. Well, it's going to be impossible unless the first one, category people, approaches zero, because everything else that he had in that equation is connected to the amount of people that are going to be there. It's just, it's unreal. And it's like, how does CO2 equal this? Like, it's a false formulation in the first place anyway, because
So the only solution to saving the earth is for everybody to kill themselves. Or is it just 15%?
Oh, well, that's not going to be adequate. 50% isn't enough. 67% is barely
needs to
enough.
go to zero.
It needs to go to zero. So 100% of what people think that they need to do to exist in the world today is a problem for the future of the terraqueous orb religion that we have.
So let me get this straight. We ought to save the earth from climate change, because if we don't, it will, the ice caps will melt, right? And then we'll be underwater, and so we'll all die. In order to prevent that, I have to kill myself. So I'm dead either way.
Right. Well, better dead than fed, I mean, it's better for us to just have less mouths to feed, because then, we're not going to deforest unnecessarily, and we're not going to overconsume, and, we won't be reliant on huge amounts of agricultural game, and nothing but lowering the number of people.
I might respect some of these IPCC people if they just start offing themselves. I might have a little more respect for at least their conviction,
Yeah, I mean,
because that would be helpful, because then no services are going to be used. Right. No energy per service is going to be used.
That's right.
That's going to reduce the amount of carbon, except we're going to cremate their body. That's going to release a lot of carbon into the atmosphere, isn't it?
Yeah, I guess, everyone's got to,
Does the United Nations, do they ever, and the IPCC, do they ever, criticize the cremation industry for all that emissions? Are they regulated like the auto industry?
That's an excellent question. I mean, because you'd think that if they were really going to try and get population down to zero, they need a lot of quick ways to dispose of all that waste, right? So
That's a lot of carbon.
It's a lot of carbon, So it's
to kill us all, that would release a lot of carbon into the. Are they sure they wouldn't melt the ice caps by killing us all?
Right. I mean, I guess it has to be. It all has to happen in 12 years, because apparently
12 years.
The world's going to end in 12 years.
So on that note, let's go back 2009 to Al Gore warns polar ice cap ice may be gone in 5 years.
Oh man, so maybe it's like the 2012 thing where we already are dead because of Waterworld, and that I guess the 2014 was the actual real end time, not 2012.
No, dude. So he says in 2009. That was before the shift in 2012. We like
Right.
split off into a alternate timeline. It changed the climate change schedule. It didn't
Right.
end it. It's still a threat. It just got pushed out. To a little.
It just had a little postponement. We're
Horror TV. The world is thinking.
No, it's not.
It's hard to capture the astonishment that the experts in the science of ice felt when they saw this minimum in 2005, which meant that the amount of ice that had melted, it's been roughly the size of the continental United States, minus an area roughly the size of Arizona. Nothing against Arizona. But the amount that melted in 2005 was equivalent to an area covering everything east of the Mississippi River in the United States. Then, when the real shock to the scientists came was in 2007, when this happened. Their phrase was, it fell off a cliff. And then the extra amount that melted was this much. Now, this covers the area of ice. It does not cover the volume of the ice, and Bob Carell referred to this. The U.S. Naval Postgraduate School has a team that integrates the U.S. Navy's nuclear submarines that go under the ice cap and satellite measurements that are calibrated to work with it. And based on that, they said actually 2008 had a smaller minimum, probably, than 2007. And these are figures that are fresh. I don't know if they've been, I don't know when they were released, but I just got them yesterday from Dr. Václav Maslowski at the Naval Postgraduate School. And this is the volumetric record of the ice. And some of the models suggest to Dr. Maslowski that there is a 75% chance that the entire North Polar ice cap during some of the summer months could be completely ice-free within the next 5 to 7 years. And Bob used
That was a lot of dependencies on that prediction, which was made by one scientist. And we're supposed to just do what? Not drive anymore?
Nod our heads and live in a shoebox and be intravenously fed glyphosate.
It's so tiresome. I mean, do you see how he sort of resembles one of these fake preachers?
Absolutely.
Who just stands up there and just likes to hear himself talk, and he's like raising his hand and tries to sound authoritative. He doesn't know what the fuck he's talking about. He's not even a good like salesman. You know what I mean? Like he can't even fake it. He can't even fake it. He's up there stuttering and umming, moving away from the microphone when he's lying. 75% chance that sometimes during the summer, all of the North Polar ice caps would be gone. Okay, so the fuck what? What are you saying is going to actually
it's like, well, this goes back to like weather modification. Like if this was really such an issue, couldn't they just like use lasers and make that part of the world colder during that time of year? I mean, to what extent? I mean, it's like they're playing this shell game where they admit that they're playing God with the weather, that they want to have that as an option for warfare, but in the same breath they're saying, "Oh, there's just nothing we can do. Everything's melting, and pay more taxes."
One of the most idiotic contradictions in this whole circus with respect to the climate change weather modification thing has to be stratospheric aerosol injections, because all this obsession about emissions, right? You go to get your car inspected primarily to make sure that you are compliant with the emission standards. Okay, so we're all obsessed about emissions. What about the global program that is being funded at your expense to inject the stratosphere with emissions? Now, I'm going to play a clip where John Brennan, formerly of the CIA, right, is speaking to the Council on Foreign Relations, which is just
another one of these kibitzing think
committee.
tanks. Yeah,
they do essentially drive foreign policy in the North American hemisphere.
right.
And they every once in a while they'll make a stunning, they'll roll something out that people had, the conspiracy theorists had talked about before, and were criticized for, but then they'll just go out and admit it, some stunning things in these meetings.
Right.
It's often on C-SPAN, and it just more like, we know that our constituents are dumb and they're dumbed down because of us, and we're gonna now roll this out, admit it, and be confident about it, and hope that you don't actually do anything about it. You don't even remember the conspiracy theory guy talking about it years ago.
Right. And don't think of the whole War of the Worlds phenomenon with H.G. Wells and him being a high-level Fabian socialist and advocating open conspiracies, and the fact that all these think tanks use that white paper method of just, sympathetic magic, coming out in the open and admitting what they're going to do, but not really advertising it, but then kind of bragging about it later, and then castigating anyone that calls them out on it as being crazy.
Right.
And it's just, it's mass gaslighting and occultistry.
Right. Yeah. But just the concept that they do these stratospheric aerosol injections to cool the earth by reflecting sunlight. But wait a minute, what about the greenhouse gas effect, right? CO2, volcanoes, smokestacks, and all this. It's supposed to emit this greenhouse gas that's going to trap the sun's rays. So are they going to prevent all the sunlight? They're just going to reflect it all? Like, it's crazy. So anyways, if y'all don't believe that they're doing it, check this out.
Another example is the array of technologies, often referred to collectively as geoengineering, that potentially could help reverse the warming effects of global climate change. One that has gained my personal attention is stratospheric aerosol injection, or SAI, a method of seeding the stratosphere with particles that can help reflect the sun's heat in much the same way that volcanic eruptions do. An SAI program could limit global temperature increases, reducing some risks associated with higher temperatures and providing the world economy additional time to transition from fossil fuels. This process is also relatively inexpensive. The National Research Council estimates that a fully deployed SAI program would cost about $10 billion yearly. As promising as it may be, moving forward on SAI would also raise a number of challenges for our government and for the international community. On the technical side, greenhouse gas emission reductions would still have to accompany SAI to address other climate change effects, such as ocean acidification, because SAI alone would not remove greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. On the geopolitical side, the technology's potential to alter weather patterns and benefit certain regions of the world at the expense of other regions could trigger sharp opposition by some nations. Others might seize on SAI's benefits and back away from their commitment to carbon dioxide reductions. And as with other breakthrough technologies, global norms and standards are lacking to guide the deployment and implementation of SAI and other geoengineering initiatives.
So the real clip there was John Brennan. I mean, is he trying to act like the program doesn't yet exist? It's just proposed. I mean, the shit exists. It's been going on clearly. Just look into your skies.
Right.
You see them. They're called chemtrails. But if you go on YouTube and you search chemtrails, then they caveat any video with a Wikipedia article, Encyclopedia Britannica. You fucking kidding me? Contrail, also called condensation trail or vapor trail, streamer of clouds sometimes observed. You know, this is their whitewash on the SAI program, just admitted to by the government.
Right.
Okay, and so like, why is YouTube just straight up trying to conceal the fact? Now, this is a video that I shot in 2012. And, it's not like it's got a lot of views or anything, but they've just algorithmically kind of retrospectively, filtered. I think I put chemtrail in the tags, right?
So they buried it.
I'm sure it was buried from the start, but now they're just like outright propagandizing this situation.
Right, doing the damage control.
Right.
Tab, yeah.
And so, you talk about, even still the fact that they've admitted it on C-SPAN, and you can go to weathermodification.com and click their client list.
Yeah.
Right? Governments all around the world. Most of the operations are in the U.S. I know we covered this on a past episode, but this is a global operation. If you even believe in the globe, right?
Right.
It's an operation that's happening in every country essentially in the world. Probably not for what they say it is.
No.
Because again, he even said he was like, we're going to be spraying all this stuff up in here to reflect the sunlight, but still sunlight's going to get in and it's going to be trapped because it's greenhouse gas, but we still need to reduce your emissions.
Right. And then,
what the fuck is that?
Totally schizophrenic. Yeah. And then, it also brings up the broader question. Well, but wait a second. I thought that we're adjacent to space. Don't these gases just eventually escape out into orbit?
See, I had a conversation recently. with a coworker of mine about this.
Mm-hmm.
We got into it about gravity, right?
Yeah.
And so I started asking some fundamental questions because it all ties together, right? You have to. It's a package deal.
Yep.
You got to believe the whole package.
Closed feedback loop tautology.
And we were talking about the atmosphere. Mm-hmm. And gravity, and how in the NASA rocketry videos where they attach a camera to the rocket,
mm-hmm.
and it passes from gravity to no gravity to orbit. But it literally is like a sort of a jolt, and then all of a sudden everything's floating.
Oh, yeah.
Okay,
magic. Yeah.
So if it's so sudden, that's got to be like a barrier.
Or a, trick photography and misleading footage.
Oh, of course it is.
But ultimately, even if you were to buy the theory, it kind of begs the question. Well, wait.
No, that's what I was asking him. Is okay. So is there a barrier or is there not? And he was like, well, no, the atmosphere is more like a gradient. And I'm like, well, then how come it goes from gravity to 0G and then now we're fixed in orbit? That doesn't make sense to me. And then also, if it's a gradient, how is the atmosphere contained and we have this greenhouse gas effect?
Right.
If it's a barrier, that's one thing, but then we're talking about a barrier.
Right.
If it's a gradient, then like you're saying,
how does that maintain a pressurized
system? It doesn't
system?
maintain a pressurized system, and so you go from positive pressure to negative pressure, and you can't have those juxtaposed without a barrier. So either we
Right.
have to believe in a barrier
Or this magical
gradient space in the
atomic
atmosphere.
voodoo.
That's
Yeah, it's
and
atomic voodoo.
This person I was talking to
Yeah.
started bringing up, well, it's at an atomic level. And
It's
I'm like, oh,
atomic
wow.
voodoo.
So it's all tied back to that as well, the atomization of material reality.
That's exactly right.
Right?
And
It's incredible.
Yeah. I mean, atomism is really the foundation of most of the modern materialist and esoteric materialist dogma, and that includes astrophysics. I mean, it really goes back to Democritus and the idea that, oh, we can reduce reality down to its smallest indivisible part, that, you know, all reality could crumble into or out of a singular substrate.
Right.
And that's a pure belief system, but that's supposedly the entire basis for the best kind of science that's ever emerged. And it's very fascinating times we're in. Kind of ominous, but I mean, truly worthwhile in investigating. It's truly amazing.
You got to proceed by inquiry.
That's right.
Which is the Zetidic newscast mantra, and how we ask all of our listeners and readers to proceed. So I want to play, just one more dagger in the heart of the climate change alarmists, the climate change priests of apocalypticism,
Radical environmental scientism.
and this is a clip by John Coleman. He's now deceased, but you'd think people who proclaim to be, sort of people of science, believers in science, you might say, would listen to the founder of the Weather Channel on this subject of climate. And I just thought he did a pretty good breakdown of some of the base level illogicalities of the climate alarmism. And I think we'll probably end on this particular clip.
Hello, I'm John Coleman, founder of the Weather Channel, original weatherman on Good Morning America, and a TV meteorologist for 55 years. I love this blue marble, our home. But we're isolated out here in space, and we human beings have a big responsibility. The future of this planet is in our control. Over the last 30 years, we have been told over and over again that we are destroying the climate of this planet through our use of fossil fuels, by leaving our carbon footprints. The CO2 is destroying the climate of this planet. We're told it is causing uncontrollable warming, and the results, we're told, is disaster looming in the very near future. Over and over again, we've been told how the ice will melt and the polar bears are going to die, how the coast will be flooded as the oceans rise, some islands totally wiped out, how powerful hurricanes are going to hit the shore, how millions will die as heat waves sweep the planet, carrying disease that will kill millions more, and our crops will fail, and our civilization will perish. All because we are using fossil fuels and leaving our carbon footprints. We're told that by running our television sets and our cars and trucks and airplanes, burning our electric lights, running heating and air conditioning, computers and cell phones, that we are destroying the climate on planet Earth. And we say, our carbon footprints, are they really doing this? The carbon dioxide that comes out the exhaust of our automobiles and out of the smokestacks of our power plants, the entire global warming frenzy is based on that carbon dioxide increase from the burning of fossil fuels. And how could that be? Isn't CO2 a natural gas that we breathe out? Isn't CO2 a gas that plants need to grow? Hasn't CO2 always been in the atmosphere? Isn't it just a trace gas that is just a fraction of the atmospheric content? Yes to all of those questions. But that very CO2, Al Gore tells us, is fueling global warming that will destroy the climate of planet Earth. And in its reports, the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has told us over and over again how this greenhouse effect is going to create destruction. They call it radiative forcing. the CO2 will, through this formula, have an impact on water vapor that greatly magnifies the greenhouse effect. And that radiative forcing, we are told, will create all of this climate frenzy. Let's go back and look at the big picture. The Earth's been around for a long, long time. We have records that go back for 300 million years and more. We see interglacial periods, that's the warm spell, nature's global warming. When human life flourishes, plants and animals grow, life is good. And ice ages, when we almost all perish, when the Earth becomes a huge ice cube. And those have altered through all history. We have had a consistent record of ice ages followed by interglacial periods, nature's global warming. The burning of fossil fuels didn't cause any of those. So we can see that temperatures and CO2 content of the atmosphere have both increased and fallen over hundreds of thousands, millions of years without causing any catastrophe and without being the result of the activities of man. Now I'm going to come up to just this interglacial period, which began about 10,000 years ago when the Ice Age ended. And during this interglacial period, we've had some very dramatic warm spells and some cool snaps, the most recent cool snap being the Little Ice Age. And then here's the warm-up that followed the use of fossil fuels. Notice it's no more dramatic than the warm-ups that preceded it. So how could that one be caused by fossil fuels? Fossil fuels didn't cause any of these others. How come we're told it's causing this rise? Civilization's only been burning fossil fuels here, starting around 1800 and up to today. Gas, oil, and coal have caused the carbon dioxide to increase in the atmosphere, no question about that. And here's the temperatures through that period, and there's been an increase of slightly more than 1/2 of 1 degree since 1880. Nothing very dramatic, but the IPP says that these rises aren't natural, but they're the result of our burning of fossil fuel. We skeptics, we say these are right in step with the temperature pattern that has occurred all these years. And I point to this, from 1940 to the mid-70s, during a period of the post-war boom when industrialization and the use of fossil fuels was increasing rapidly, the temperatures stayed steady. They weren't linked to the fossil fuels at all. So here's the increase of fossil fuels. Here's the pattern of temperatures in the blue line. And it is closely linked not to fossil fuels, but to the solar activity, the rise and fall of the number of sunspots and solar flares. Now, the IPCC ran its computer models. That's all it had to try to justify and prove the authenticity of its theory or hypothesis about radiative forcing and CO2 causing global warming. And they showed a warm-up, but that has failed. Now look what's happened. While CO2 continues to rise in this new century, this is 2002, this is 2008, through this period, temperatures have stayed steady or even significantly declined in the last several years. So that absolutely blows that prediction, the CO2 prediction of the IPCC, out of the water. Here are their computer model predictions. Here's the temperature performance. I'm afraid their hypothesis has been proven wrong in only a few years. And to me, that seems to be the end. The hypothesis is dead. It's time to stop talking about it. And then came, about Thanksgiving time, the release of all those emails from the Hadley Center in Europe, in England, which showed how the data had been manipulated and how amazing the performance was by those scientists to try to keep the warming going even though it wasn't happening. And they even continued to release scary reports right during that period. That's shocking. The truth is that the ice at the North Pole has fallen off and has started to rise again. This year, 2009, greater than 2008 or 7. And as for the prediction of stronger hurricanes, you know we had a very quiet year in 2009. Not a single significant hurricane occurred and hit the U.S. And the polar bear population, it's expanding rapidly, and there are more polar bears than there were in 1970. There isn't any climate crisis. It was totally manufactured by scientists who got linked to the radiative forcing formula, which they had received billions of dollars to develop and try to prove. So I think we can go right ahead with our very good lifestyle, our modern society. We can even power Las Vegas and continue with life. Yes, I love the earth, and I want to come up with alternate energy sources. I want to protect the water and the air, but I know that our earth is going to be just fine with the burning of fossil fuels as long as they last. We can have a...
So you talked about mathematization earlier,
Right.
right? And he popped up that little equation at the end
Right.
after totally debunking all of their math and models with, I mean, this is a guy who still probably believes a lot of what NASA says, and
Sure.
but he's using their own methods, and even by their own metrics, they're just
So off.
completely off. What did you think about that clip, right?
Well, he's basically just applying their chartism against their suggestions and speculation. They're like, well, actually, there's all these other indicators that are showing that this is not an accurate prediction, or
Right.
that this isn't a crisis by any stretch. It's basically aggrandized equations and groupthink
That don't even
Yeah.
pan out if you even agree with the measurement methods, and that's
Right.
something
that's also highly dubious.
he appeared on I just want to make this point on the Alex Jones show a while back. I remember hearing him talk about the fallacy of their models, and one of them was the use of the thermometer, right? That was not invented, it was invented in the last 200 years, used systemically in the last 80, right? But even systemically, it was not, they didn't have thermometers in all of, in a high resolution around the globe, which would include various
Right.
elevations and places of extremes, that are hard to get to and expensive to get to. Nobody's put the resources into that. And then, so you really, again, going back to that ridiculous chart, the evidence on the ice cores, right? You have to believe that they can accurately go back so far. But John Coleman was saying the thermometer, which is how we would even measure things today, has a pretty high degree of a margin of error.
Sure it does.
Right? If you go back 80 years, a margin of error up to 3 degrees, which is fine if you're setting the thermostat in your house. But if we're going to, bicker and basically exert authoritarianism across the world, reduce, the population, deindustrialize
the
over,
entire world.
a 1/10 of a degree average or something. It's okay. So it's a little warmer. Like, y'all are absolutely out of your mind.
Well, and it's like, wait, and then carbon dioxide levels supposedly spiked when life was teeming on the Earth. So how do you reconcile all the spike in carbon dioxide today with it being somehow bad for life? Doesn't carbon dioxide ultimately fuel the expansion
That's
of life?
just the most basic, and these people talk about science all the time, and it's like, we learned that in science, I'm not one to compliment the public education system, but we did learn that plants breathe CO2. And so it's just it's a bold thing that they're trying to do, that they're trying to sell.
Such hubris. I mean, there's just the amount of absurdity that goes into it. It's part and parcel to the whole, Terraqueous orb monkey man hypotheses, that it's speculatively ensconced itself in the entire substrate of science. And so today, when people think science, they automatically adopt this basically occult hermeneutic that's been passed down through oligarchical ideologies for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So instead of seeing that as a recapitulation of old world mind control and feudalist cycles, people are seeing it as some some new enlightened way of interpreting the world. It's like, no, there's nothing new under the sun here. This is just a repackaging and a reformulation of a lot of the same misanthropic elitist elements that have been.
And that's why when you actually ask the right questions of people like Neil deGrasse Tyson or Bill Nye, they will tell you that they, in their mind, the logic that they've set up for themselves, you are infringing on their right because they subscribe to this religion of climate apocalypticism and catastrophe, such that it is to them as if you are stabbing your neighbor. And that's why you support government force in the case of assault, right? I mean, you say yes, and they say, well, okay, this is assault. You're assaulting my children by not reducing your carbon footprint, so we should arrest you. That is what people like Bill Nye and Neil deGrasse Tyson, that is what they've signed up for.
Well, and that is just like Minority Report level totalitarianism.
Yeah.
And it's like neo-Stalinism as well.
Right.
You show me the man, I'll show you the crime. I mean, even though you're coming up with rational refutations of their bald speculation, your rational refutation is a crime, and their bald speculation is law.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's just like, call a spade a spade. It's right there in your face. It's this whole open conspiracy H.G. Wells methodology, where they can, basically admittedly lose any rational debate, but it doesn't matter to them because they have this force majeure backing from the establishment because they're parroting the preferred ideology.
Right.
Yeah.
So the IPCC's got 4,000 of the top scientists, and they have put forth the evidence, which you can find at climate.nasa.gov/evidence. But here's a guy, he's not a grad student, 10 years away from his PhD. It looks like he's got some gray hair. You included this
in the article.
You want to set this one up?
Well, so basically, this guy is a meteorologist in the field, and he basically applies some common sense considerations to the speculative, panic-based claims of a lot of the environmentalist alarmists. And even though he accepts even some of the premises or some of the suggestions of the data that there is warming occurring, and as we've already done, that can be problematized in itself, but even though he kind of accepts that, he basically still admits I can't buy this ideology after certain points, thinking about these particular considerations that he brings up. And one of them is just what places were being measured back then that's supposedly hard and fast, chartable data versus all of the various methods that we're using today to, measure entirely different environments.
Right.
And then, injecting that data into the overall average that wasn't considered in previous data that were also charting in the same graph. So it's...
So even in the institutions, there are still practitioners of legitimate science looking at this and coming to their own conclusions, which are sort of obvious to some and not to others.
Right. And, even though there's some, at some point, even people who are careerists in Science Incorporated one way or another, there's still enough of a consciousness that says, well, I can't just accept any claim that purports to be scientific because it's dressed up that way.
Right.
Let's see a little
just
bit more
because you've
behind
got
the methodology.
a few, an acronym.
Right. And as Tarpley aptly put, the dark hand of formalism.
Right.
Loved that. And the fetishization of math. Right?
Yeah, that's it. Fetishization of math. That's it.
That's excellent.
So let's start out with the basic idea that there's this debate in this country over global warming. There's some people who call it a complete hoax, and there are some people who completely embrace it, so forth. Where do you stand in that spectrum?
Well, I at one time was very much embracing the whole concept that we had a real problem, we had to do something about it. Back in 1988, James Hansen actually was the impetus for that for me in his presentation before Congress. But as I learned more and more about the issue, I discovered that maybe it's not as bad as it's made out to be. Some of it is hype, but there's also some data that has not been explored, and there's been some investigations that need to be done that haven't been done. And so now I'm in the camp of, we have some global warming, no doubt about it, but it may not be as bad as we originally thought because there are other contributing factors.
What bothers you most about the arguments that there is serious global warming?
They want to change policy, they want to apply taxes, and these kinds of things may not be the actual solution for making a change to our society.
What are you saying, that they're biased essentially, or motivated by something else? What?
There's a term that was used to describe this. It's called noble cause corruption. And actually, I was a victim of that at one time, where you're so fervent in your belief that you have to do something. You're saving the planet, you're making a difference, you're making things better, that you're so focused on this goal of fixing it or changing that you kind of forget to look along the path to make sure that you haven't missed some things. I started looking into the idea that weather stations have been slowly encroached upon by urbanization and siting issues over the last century, meaning that our urbanization affected the temperature. And this was something that was very clear if you looked at the temperature records. But what wasn't clear is how it affected the trend of temperatures. And so that's been something that I've been investigating. Anyone who's ever stood next to a building in the summertime at night, a brick building that's been out in the summer sun, if you stand next to it at night, you can feel the heat radiating off of it. That's a heat sink effect. And over the last 100 years, our country, in fact the world, has changed. We've gone from having mostly a rural agrarian society to one that is more urban and city-based. And as a result, the infrastructure has increased. We've got more freeways, more airports, we've got more buildings, more streets, all these things. Those are all heat sinks. During the day, solar insulation hits these objects and these surfaces, and it stores heat in these objects. At night, it releases that heat. Now, if you are measuring temperature in a city that went from having maybe 10% of non-permeable surface to maybe 90% over 100 years, that's a heat sink effect, and that should show up in the records. The problem is that it's been such a slow, subtle change over the last 100 years. It's not easy to detect, and that's been the challenge, and that's what I've been working on.
Essentially, you're saying that the records they're using for documenting the temperature at any given time aren't exactly accurate?
I'm saying that the data might be biased by these influences to a percentage. Yes, we have some global warming. It's clear the temperature has gone up in the last 100 years. But what percentage of that is from carbon dioxide, and what percentage of that is from changes in the local and measurement environment?
I'm going to go back to what we were talking about a little bit earlier. You say that there are people invested in promoting the concern about global warming. Is there a lot of money involved?
Well, global warming has become essentially a business in its own right. There are NGOs, there are organizations, there are whole divisions of universities that are set up to study this factor. And so there's lots of money involved. And so I think that there's a tendency to want to keep that going and not really look at what might be different.
Dr. Muller at the University of California at Berkeley had similar concerns, went back and looked at the data, took much more data than anybody else had, and concluded, well, maybe there were some problems, but basically the conclusions were right. There is global warming, and it comes from carbon dioxide, which is made by man. Do you buy that?
Unfortunately, he has not succeeded in terms of how science views, a successful inquiry. His papers have not passed peer review. They had some problems. Some of the problems I identified, others have identified problems as well. For example, he goes much further back to about 1750 in terms of temperature. Well, from my own studies, I know that temperature really wasn't validated and homogenized, where everything was measured the same way, until the Weather Bureau came into being about in 1890. Prior to that, thermometers were hung in and exposed to the atmosphere in all kinds of different ways. Some were hung under the shade of trees, some were on the north side of houses, some were out in the open in the sun. And so the temperature fluctuations that we got from those readings prior to 1890 was quite broad. And I don't believe they provide a representative signal because the exposure is all wrong. And Dr. Muller did not take any of that into account.
His conclusion, though, is that basically global warming exists and that the scientists, no matter what the problems were pretty much right on.
I agree with him that global warming exists. However, the ability to attribute the percentage of global warming to CO2 versus other man-made influences is still an open question.
I want to ask you a little bit about attitudes toward this among the public. We talked to a public opinion specialist at Stanford who says there's been 80% belief in global warming and man-made global warming throughout this country for the last 15 years. Do you buy that?
Well, I've looked at a number of opinion polls. You'll find a lot of them on my blog that we've covered. And depending on how you ask the question, we'll sometimes give you a different answer. My view is that the view of global warming peaked about at the time that Al Gore came out with his movie, An Inconvenient Truth. But ever since then, other factors have kicked in, ClimateGate, for example, and it has become less of an issue. As in fact, you hardly see politicians talking about it anymore or pushing it as an issue. What's been happening now is it's become a regulation issue. It's gotten away from the political arena and into the bureaucratic regulation arena. And so people, I believe, based on the polls I've seen, aren't quite as believing as they used to be, and I think the trend is downward.
What do you think is the upshot of your attitude toward this? Should the Congress, should the American public say, you know, nothing's been proven yet, we should wait? Or should we go ahead with trying to solve what many people consider a really scary problem?
You mentioned a really scary problem, and I think that's part of the issues. Some people don't respond well to scare tactics, and there have been some scare tactics used by some of the proponents on the other side of the issue. And that's where the overselling of it comes in. But this is a slow problem, and it requires a slow solution, I believe. For example, our infrastructure for electricity and so forth and highways didn't happen in 5 years or 10 years. It happened over a century. We can't just rip all that up or change it in the space of 5, 10, or 15 years because it'll be catastrophic to our economy. We need a slow change solution, one that is a solution that changes over time at about the same rate as climate change. More efficient technology.
So we're joking. We're watching this in the CNN studio, and I said, "This is a guy who can probably, frame his own doghouse." You're like, he's a practical guy. Here he is, just looking at the situation,
right?
Zetetically, like you said, and he must be so frustrated.
Well, because on the one hand, he has to kind of maintain his career, so he just cannot question the fundamental premises of global warming. He's not going to go there. But the fact that he's able to completely devastate and rip apart the foundational methodologies, even though he's accepting the premises, is still on the right path.
Totally.
So I think that his discussion of measurement indexes being homogenized only as late as 1890, and that this whole NASA gobbledygook of we've got accurate ways of determining temperature from 800,000 years ago. Like, no, you don't.
Yeah, but this is a guy who, he's got a lot of field experience. He's got some gray hairs. He's been on the ground, and he's seen the rollout of this. He's been around for that as an adult, right? And he's seen it get more and more radical. He talks about the overselling of it. And we're definitely at that point now, right? Like just as the Jeffrey Epstein stuff.
Absolutely. They
you know,
had to
they
fan
just,
the flames all over again, even though he's right that the trend is down. People are like, you know what, like they've been talking about polar ice caps melting, and first it was global cooling back in the 50s and 60s, and then it changed to global warming. But even though the temperatures are actually going down, we can't admit it because global warming has to be real. And it's just like this schizophrenic gaslighting.
Yeah, but this guy's also in that last part there. He's really calling it what it is.
Right.
That the infrastructure, our electricity. He's talking about our modern conveniences, our industrial revolution. He's talking about ripping it up. Now, that's not him saying we should do that. That's him saying that's what's being proposed.
That's the consequences
That's the
of a Greta Thunberg being like, 50% is not enough. After 20 or 30 years, we need to make it.
And he says, see, again, I give this guy credit for pointing out the freaking obvious fact of the all the weather stations being by places that are urbanized, and you know we're pouring black asphalt all over the ground. It's going to be hot there, you know, relative to the actual rest of the earth. But he says, oh, you know, the infrastructure is devastating, you know, to rip up in 15 years. You know, this is a process, and it's like therein lies his continued acceptance of the premise that, okay, would it still not be devastating for it to happen over 100 years? Is that still a good transition to go from an industrialized, like wealthy nation to a deindustrialized, poor nation?
Depopulated.
Okay, so if it's devastating over 15 years, isn't it still devastating over 100 years or 80 years? Like we're still going backwards, dude. We're ripping up the infrastructure. We don't want to do that.
We don't want to do that.
Because it's really not hurting anything except for a bunch of nerds looking at, you know, their charts and their temperature readings and, you know, catastrophizing around that. Right?
Well, and then again, it's the whole perpetuation of the terraqueous orb cult. And, you know, AKA homeworld, planet Earth, Big Bang cosmology. So, I mean, do we really believe that the longest standing treaty in human history, the Antarctic Treaty, amongst the most nations, is for purely neutral, scientific, quote unquote, experiments like ice core drilling? It's like, no, there's known seed vaults. There's probably an F ton of terra incognito that's totally inhabitable. I mean,
both above and below ground.
Oh yeah,
above and below ground. The idea that we've only drilled 8 miles is a whitewash.
Yeah,
that's what the oil industry has publicly done.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I mean,
it's weird. You go down 8 miles. There's this oil. That we bring up and we refine, and that's, you know, just a lot of rock and eventually metal and then molten core. Nothing down there worth exploring. Nothing beyond Antarctica worth exploring. The only place you want to go is up into the sky, but oh wait, only NASA can do it, and they're also climate catastrophists themselves. I mean, it's just so circular and circuitous, like back into, you know, the closed feedback loop of exterminism, and, you know, all back to the source, which is just more government propaganda.
Right. And we've discussed government as being literally etymologically mind control or control of the mind.
Right.
So it just
don't even have an imagination.
And just let reality be dictated to you for your own good,
just
because
sit in
you
a corner
can't do any better
and vibrate over in anxiety over the carbon emissions. Hold your breath until you don't emit any more CO2, and sayonara. Right? That's what they want you to do.
And meanwhile, you know, just believe that there's a discrete ice continent at the bottom of a terraqueous orb where there's only core drilling and
seed vaulting
and a barbershop pole that is sticking upside down, which is a South Pole, supposedly. Yeah. I mean, you have to accept that if you accept
the idea that cow farts and human activity are going to end the planet as we know it.
So on that note, I'm just going to close the episode. This is your hosts of the Zitidic Newscast, Dave, and Xavier Diamant. Please visit our website, zitidic.news, and subscribe to the Zitidic Newscast on the right-hand side. You can also visit our YouTube channel, which you just search Zitidic News Network. And for as long as they will allow us, we will post our episodes with video and hopefully high-quality audio on the YouTube. We're going to be ramping up additional content, not just episodes, but we're going to start working with other channels and having interviews and other sort of sidebar conversations, not limited to the bi-weekly episodic approach, long form that we've been doing. We're hoping to expand our operation. As an example of that, I did a couple reports in the last week I want to highlight. One around Orange County, North Carolina's proposed, it wasn't proposed, right? It was just suggested. It wasn't suggested. It was just discussed, the gun discharge regulation, because some residents who were moving into a new residential development complained about gunfire out in the country. And so I did the work of downloading the discussion that took place in the halls of Delphi in Orange County, where they're talking about the gun discharge regulations and how to enforce them. And it was,
hypothetically, of course,
it was an interesting conversation. This is just one example of many that more that we hope to be dropping on the Zitidic News website.
Absolutely.
As well as additional features. Not much has changed in that regard. We've just been getting ready for this episode, and let's just stay in touch.
Absolutely.
Any parting comments, Xavier?
Just stay tuned. I think that we've got some pretty eclectic but unique and insightful material that dovetails in with a lot of pertinent ongoing news. And, the article will be posted shortly, probably tomorrow. And stay tuned.
Thank you. Signing off.
Yeah.